So a question we've been asking everyone, and if you, by the way, you can state your name on this first one, is why are you running and why are you the best candidate?
My name is MJ Hegar. I'm running for the U.S. Senate against John Cornyn. And I'm running because I took an oath to support and defend our Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, when I put the uniform on to serve our nation in the military. And I spent 3 tours in Afghanistan fighting a foreign threat. And I was told we were putting on the uniform and going overseas to keep the violence off our shores. And yet I feel very betrayed by our representatives who have allowed the gun violence epidemic and people in Texas dying from lack of insurance coverage and all sorts of things to happen here while we were off defending the Constitution. Now I see a domestic threat to our Constitution in the actions of this administration and the inactions, selectively inaction, I guess you could say also. And I feel like this race is really a fulfillment of the oath that I took, and that if I stood by and let this happen, then I would not be fulfilling my oath to support and defend our Constitution against the domestic threat of abuse of power, of ignoring Congress, not respecting the co-equal branches of government, confirming a bunch of hyper-partisan, ultra-conservative court judges to the federal bench that are not qualified largely. Beyond that, though, I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, too. So I definitely am concerned about the world that they're growing up into. Climate change is my number one issue. Obviously, healthcare is the number one thing on Texans' minds. And our current representation is ignoring climate change, not doing anything about the healthcare crisis here, ignoring the fact that we have children in cages on our southern border, ignoring the gun violence epidemic that is threatening our children and causing a state of hypervigilance among an entire generation. And I just think that we can do better and that we deserve better. I grew up here in Texas, and I look at DC and I don't see a lot of the Texas values that I grew up with reflected back. I don't see people thinking for themselves. I don't see independent thought. I don't see strength and integrity and courage. I see a lot of people trying to get reelected, trying to protect themselves, trying to bolster their egos, trying to grab cameras, bowing to special interests and dark money and big dollar donors. And I know that that's not the way our founding fathers envisioned our government working. When I was in DC, trying to make our military stronger, fighting to open jobs for women in the military, I saw a lot that really turned my stomach. I got treated a lot like I needed to be a donor or somebody with a lot of political capital, and I did not accept the system that they told me I had to operate in order to enact change. I rejected the way they told me how to get things done, and I actually built a broad coalition of Republicans and Democrats to open those jobs for women and be successful. And I think that more people need to go to DC, not accept the system that they're being handed, disrupt the system effectively, and actually get our government working for regular working families in Texas again.
Senator West.
My name is Royce West. I'm from the Dallas area. I'm a state senator here in Texas. I think our country is at a pivotal point in its history. I've never seen the 3 branches of government so divided. I've never seen a president that's been so divisive as it relates to issues in this country. I think when Donald Trump initially said that in Charlottesville that there are good people on both sides, it gave me pause in terms of the President of the United States of America defending that type of behavior. I've never seen a president that has been so, frankly, unprepared for the integrity of the office of president. It's every day that the media portrays him as a person that's not a truth teller, that's a liar. They use those extreme words. I've never seen a president that has been so effective in taking complete control of the Republican Party and making certain that he keeps everyone in line. John Cornyn, who was an officer of the court, took an oath to be an officer of the court to uphold the Constitution of the United States and also Texas. And then we have this impeachment, where Cornyn and others have basically said that they do not want to hear evidence of the behavior of the President of the United States. This divisiveness that I'm talking about warrants a new approach. It warrants having someone that has the experience of being in the minority party here in the state of Texas, frankly, for the last 26 years, that's been able to get things done. When you begin to look at my experience, I want you to look at my resume and look at my references. When you begin to look at my resume, you see that I've been able to get things done as a minority in a minority party in the state of Texas, reaching across party lines to get those things done. When you begin to look at criminal justice, things I've got done, hopefully we'll get an opportunity to get into them, help lead the fight in terms of health care in the state. Women's rights, I take no back seat to anyone as it relates to women's rights. Veterans' rights, coming home from wars in this world. When I begin to look at issues that I will help champion, I want to be held accountable. And I'm telling everyone here, hold me accountable for sitting at the table to fix health care in this country. I think it should be a fundamental right for all citizens, and that we should make certain that we have a public option, but make certain also that people have the ability to have their own health insurance plan. Hold me accountable also for making certain we deal with gun violence in this country, which I've dealt with in terms of legislation since Ann Richardson was governor. I hope to continue to work on those issues and many others during the course of my first cycle as your U.S. Senator.
We'll start with you on this one and go the other way. What specifically about Senator Cornyn's record, his achievements or lack of them, is leading you to challenge him at this time?
Well, I mean, you look at the health care, his position on health care. He hasn't really taken a strong role in terms of health care. Pre-existing conditions. I think that he, along with other Republicans, are trying to wait to see what the court is going to do in order to strike down Obamacare. We have a president that he is responding to, he being Cornyn, that basically wants to throw the baby out with the bathwater just because of who the father is in terms of health care. Are there problems with Obamacare? Affordable care, as a lot of people like to say it is, yes, there are. But Cornyn is not taking the time to try to fix the problems, as we do with all legislation. He's trying to throw it out and get us back to where we go. We've got to look at Texas having 17% uninsured in this state. And Cornyn is not recognizing that that is, in fact, a problem here in Texas, but also in this country. And so I don't see him doing anything. When you begin to look at issues concerning gun sentence, yes, he passed a quote-unquote background check bill, but it didn't go far enough. It dealt with federal agencies and not necessarily with the purchase of guns. Dan Patrick is even talking about making certain that we have background checks in terms of private sales. I hadn't heard Cornyn say anything about that at all. And then when you begin to think about everything that this president has done, Cornyn has backed without real question whatsoever. And so we don't need a person that's going to be in Washington that backs the president on everything that he or she does. We need a person that can think independent of that person. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand being a state senator that a lot of times there are party votes that you have to take. I understand that. But you don't have to be 100% supportive of everything that the president does, especially when Texas values, and how I define Texas values, I'm talking about values of all the people in the state are in fact implicated in the decisions that you have to make.
Look, in the military, yes, it's important that we look at what decisions are made, but it's also people in the military tend to look at how those decisions are made, and that says a lot to us about the quality and who we can trust as a leader. I don't think it's just his party line votes. It's the way he answers questions when he's asked about, how do you feel about Governor Abbott saying that we're not taking refugees, things like that. He says, well, let me check in with my party. And I don't think that that's an answer that Texans swallow very easily. We want people to think for themselves, to do what's best for us, and to think in our best interests. Now, the state of our country, the state of our state is, of course, most people know, and I completely agree, that we are on the front lines of most of the issues that we see in the headlines. Yes, we have the worst uninsured rate here in Texas. We're getting hit by climate change all over the state, but really badly in Houston especially. We have a gun violence epidemic. We have a women's health epidemic, where we have women's health services being under attack and politicized in a state whose maternal mortality rate competes with third world countries. And yet Senator Cornyn has been in statewide office in one way or another for nearly 4 decades. He has to own some of this. On the campaign trail, people ask me all the time, they say, I don't understand his voting record. I don't understand the legislation that he puts forward. It's not really helping us. Why does he do this? And I say, if you don't understand it, then you haven't looked at his FEC report. If you look at the people he's getting money from, his legislation and his voting record makes perfect sense. He's actually very good at serving the people he's serving. He's just not serving us. So when he legislates in a way that allows the gun lobby to make billions of dollars on gun sales, and by the way, a lot of those sales are trafficking south of our border, 250,000 firearms a year, causing a violence epidemic that causes a humanitarian crisis at the border, which fills the private detention facilities to capacity, and those detention facilities donate to John Cornyn. So he's getting money from both ends of that cycle. He's getting money from Big Pharma. No wonder he won't pass actual common sense pharmaceutical reform that can make people able to afford their prescription medications. He's getting money from the health insurance industry. So of course he doesn't care that those of us, struggling to try to find access to affordable quality care, he's never had to worry about that before. So we need to get people out of office who have been there for nearly 4 decades like this. And I don't think our founding fathers and the constitutional framers intended for these to be careers. They intended for people to have careers, step away from their careers to serve their communities in office, and then come back. So we need term limits. We need a lot of ethics and campaign finance reform. But specifically with Cornyn, it's not just his party line votes. It's his thought process and his lack of being able to put Texans first. I think that the fact that he has not been able to really improve the lives of working Texans in any way that's been meaningful in his time in office means that if he was working for me for 40 years and having these kind of results, I would fire him.
Let's go through your policy positions on some of the major issues. We'll start with healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
You could talk about how would you expand access to healthcare, and be specific as much as you can.
So, did you want me to start?
We'll
Okay.
start.
I worked in healthcare for 5 years. A lot of people know I was a helicopter pilot and I was shot down, and they know that side of the story, but they don't realize that I actually worked here in Austin for one of the largest employers in Central Texas. I worked for the Seton Healthcare family for 5 years, and it was very clear then that the costs in our ability to keep the lights on were unsustainable. And the reason for that is because there are so many people without insurance. People are worried about how are we going to pay to make sure that everybody can be covered. And really the fact is that what we can't afford is what we're doing right now, which is paying for the most expensive type of care, the urgent care and the emergency services for people who should be getting seen by their general practitioner for things. So when you go into the doctor's office and you pay $50 for a tablet of Tylenol, you're actually paying for everybody else's health care already. So when I was working in healthcare, that's when the Affordable Care Act was implemented. I got to see how it got gutted and sabotaged for political football and led to people losing their lives here in Texas. And I thought back to when was I taken care of the best, because I had a pre-existing condition growing in my belly and I was facing getting laid off because Seton was getting bought out by Ascension. So I was lamenting the days when I had, TRICARE, which was military Medicare. And it really made me realize that Medicare is the most superior product, and I wish everybody had access to it. I didn't think that it was fair that I had access to it just because I was in the military when I was with the Guard. So I would like to see all Texas families have access to that. I do believe healthcare is a human right. Access to quality, affordable, because affordability is access. Access to quality, affordable healthcare is a human right, is an American value, but it is also an American value that we allow individuals and families to determine what that means for them. So I do think that the public option is the way to go. And no conversation about healthcare is complete without talking about reducing the cost of pharmaceuticals. That is a free market and a regulatory working together answer. And it's also not complete without a conversation about women's healthcare. I was in McAllen a couple nights ago, talking to a woman who had a partial mastectomy when she was 30 at Planned Parenthood. And the fact that we are attacking clinics that provide access to women's healthcare services in a state that has a high maternal mortality rate and rural areas that have no access to healthcare, that some of them have to drive 30, 45 minutes or an hour just to get to an emergency room, We can't afford to politicize these issues anymore. We are losing people, they're dying, families are losing their moms, and it's having a huge impact throughout our state. We're not going to be able to prioritize women's health care in this state and in this country until we have more women at the table.
You want specificity. The reality is this, is that we need to make certain that healthcare is a fundamental right for all citizens of this country. We need to make certain that we deal with issues concerning affordability. And how do we deal with that? We've got to look at the tax cuts that the president has put in place to figure out whether or not those tax cuts are reasonable, or whether or not we need to rethink those tax cuts in order to fund portions of healthcare. We need to make certain, as I said previously, that there is in fact an option for persons who want to maintain their independent healthcare plans, like unions and things of that nature. When you begin to think about the numbers that we currently have under the Affordable Care Act, when President Obama was in office, we had over 22 million people that were able to get additional insurance. That number is down now under this president. And as I said a moment ago, we've got to make certain that when we get back into office, that is those persons that believe that healthcare should be a fundamental right, that we fix the issues associated with the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. We've got to make certain that pre-existing conditions are in fact taken care of. I'll make certain that I work on that. Women's rights issues in terms of choice issues, yes, those must be addressed. Rural health care, I help try to address those issues as a state senator, and I've done that. Mortality rates, I've done that also. I'll continue to do that as a U.S. Senator because I know what those issues are. I've had people come to me to deal with those types of issues. In terms of the use of teleconferences or meta conferences, we need to be able to use those also in order to reach rural communities in this country, because we know for a fact that rural health care is frankly on critical care right now. The fact is we're beginning to see more and more hospitals, rural hospitals, that are closing down. So we've got to make certain we take steps in order to improve not only the performance of those hospitals, but the placement of those hospitals, and putting in place the nurses and the doctors that will be necessary in order to treat the persons in that area. We have great residential programs in the state of Texas that have persons in the urban areas, but we've got to make certain they're also in the rural areas. In terms of the issues of prescription drugs, yes, I think all Republicans, not just Cornyn, but that's a party line deal with a lot of the Republicans, that they're taking more and more money from the pharmaceutical giants. And instead of just letting them have access to talk to them about the issues, they're frankly following what the pharmaceutical giants want them to do. It's not a problem having access, but if you're consistently voting for them, then that's a big issue right there. And most Republicans are doing that. And so we need to make certain that as we go through this health care, that we look at the pharmaceutical issues and we do what we need to do in order to reduce the cost of prescription drugs in this country.
Same question on immigration, such a critical issue for our state in particular. Again, be specific, what do you favor, what don't you favor?
My grandfather was probably the first African-American chief felony prosecutor, first African-American to be a chief machinist mate in the United States Navy. I was born in Annapolis. Obviously, my grandfather wanted my mother to marry Navy, but she decided to marry Army, and I ended up in Texas. So I'm familiar with the military. The fact is that when we look at the border issues, I just don't look at what we're doing south of the border here, but altogether. We've never had a situation, at least during my lifetime, where we've had a president take children, separate families, and take children and put them in the cages. That's what we're dealing with. As opposed to having a holistic approach in terms of some codification of laws dealing with immigration, we're doing it by executive order. First of all, we need to figure out how to have some codification of the immigration laws in this country. What would I do? Number one, I'm not for border walls. I mean, the lie that the president told was that we were going to have Mexico pay for them. Well, that since fell apart. And the question then becomes, how do we use technology best in order to defend our borders, not only in the South, but the entire country? The second issue is making certain that we put the resources in to do a couple of things. guide our Health and Human Services policies to prevent family separation in the manner in which it was done under this administration, and also put monies into enforcement, and also having a judicial infrastructure in place that is going to be efficient and can timely deal with the issues concerning immigration. We need to make certain we deal with the DACA issue in terms of finding a pathway for the citizenship. If you look at my record, you'll see when DACA students came before the State Education Committee, I worked very closely with them on issues, and frankly, had them working out of my Senate office to try to find solutions to DACA-related problems. I have a sensitivity to that issue. I have a demonstrated track record to that issue, and I'm going to make certain that we do everything in our power to find a pathway to citizenship. Should we have the laws in place right now? And I think Julian Castro talked about whether we should continue to criminalize border crossings, or whether it should be a civil penalty. What I believe is this: there's some issues, some persons that are coming across this border, yes, it should be a criminal offense, especially those that are coming across with a criminal record. But the question becomes one of whether all persons coming across this border should in fact be labeled a criminal. I don't think so. I think that we can look at that, have Homeland Security work, take a look at those laws, and figure out and recommend to Congress what persons coming across should be labeled civil penalties, and what persons coming across should be labeled criminal penalties. And so from that vantage point, I think that those things can be done and would make a greater impact on dealing with immigration issues in this country.
I think we need comprehensive immigration reform that's more reflective of who we are as a country. And I think that most Texans look at our current immigration policy and do not feel like that's reflective of that. I look at immigration as part of a bigger slice of a national security and a foreign policy pie. We have a reputation to maintain. We have alliances to maintain. We have a relationship with the UN that's degrading to the point where now it looks like the representative from China is going to be in charge of the world's intellectual property. We have to maintain a presence and a reputation on the global stage. We have to maintain our presence as the leader of the free world, which is a privilege that we enjoy that we could lose if we continue down this path. Committing our own human rights violations on our own southern border takes away our ability to lecture China on, their human rights violations and their treatment of the Uyghurs, for example. Comprehensive immigration reform that's reflective of our values. We absolutely do not need to be stealing from the military construction budget and stealing land from Texas landowners and cattle ranchers to build a wall that's not going to be effective. During my 3 years working with the Counter-Drug Task Force, I can tell you that a physical wall is not the answer. But the answers are not going to just come out of D.C. They're going to come out of Texas. They're going to come out of other border states. And we need to bring the border communities that are on the front lines of this crisis into the conversation a lot more. And that's what I plan to do when I'm the next senator from the state of Texas, is have those communities have a voice at my table while we're building these solutions. We need to protect dreamers. We need to treat asylum seekers at our southern border the same way we treat asylum seekers from other countries, without asking what color their skin is and whether or not they have health insurance. I believe that we need to protect the people who are seeking citizenship. For example, I served with a lot of people in the military who are seeking citizenship through military service, which I think is a very honorable way to try to show that you support this country and see yourself as an American. You go and you fight for this country. We have people fighting for our country in combat zones who get injured with a traumatic brain injury, which, by the way, is not just a headache, is a serious injury, or PTSD, and they come back to the States and commit minor misdemeanors that get them deported, and then they don't have access to VA care. We just need to start looking at this through the lens of who do we want to be as a country, who do we want to communicate to the world that we are, and start having our immigration policies reflect that. We have to fully fund the asylum courts at the borders. We're hearing all the time about people who, the lawyers down there who feel like they can't process these asylum claims properly. And of course, we absolutely must immediately end family separation. So we have a lot of work to do, but the good news is when we have people doing that work who come from the border communities and representatives who are there serving people instead of donors, those solutions are really not that far out of grasp.
Another issue that hits close to home with the deadly mass shootings in Texas. Let's talk about gun violence again. Be specific about your policy positions so far as reforms go. What do you favor in town?
So I grew up here in Texas, and I understand the gun culture here. I myself am a responsible gun owner, but I also have 2 toddlers. And I recognize that they're not mutually exclusive, protecting our children and defending our Second Amendment rights. We can do both through common sense gun safety legislation. Even this president wants background checks, universal background checks, but he caves when he gets pressure from the gun lobby. So when nearly 90% of our country wants universal background checks, if we had a reflective representative government, 90% of our legislators would want universal background checks. So there are simple things that a lot of people are talking about. We need to get universal background checks. We need to fund the CDC fully to be able to actually achieve the culture change that we're looking for, not just the legislative change. And we need to stop selling weapons of war to the public. You know, I myself have been shot with one of these weapons. I have been trained and screened to use these weapons in the military. I have, as a medevac pilot, I've seen what these weapons do to a body, and I'm telling you that they don't belong in the hands of civilians. We have to stop selling them. When we've stopped selling them in the past, we have seen a huge declination in mass shootings and in gun violence. And so we already have the data that shows that that will work. But I think that we need to go further. And I know that as a U.S. Senator, I can't enact something that will result in universal end to open carry, but I will use my position as a leader and my megaphone to be able to amplify that most responsible gun owners in Texas do want an end to open carry. Most responsible gun owners don't want to flaunt their weapons in people's faces. They just want to be able to protect themselves and their families. I would argue that the gun violence epidemic actually does represent the greatest threat to our Second Amendment rights. And so we responsible gun owners need to have a seat at the table, need to do what we can to enact common sense gun safety legislation that can protect our kids, that can stop traumatizing a generation of kids who sign up for classes and have to find the exits or do active shooter drills that do almost as much damage as an actual incident would do to their psyche. And we have to stop trafficking so many weapons south of our border. In 2018, I believe it was, the Border Patrol only seized 107 firearms. Not 107,000, 107. We have to do better. We can do better. We need to lead on this issue like we lead the free world around the globe and stand up and show people that we are not a country that's going to allow our land to be the war zone that it is now. I used to say not allow us to become the war zone I left behind in Afghanistan, but I was an hour outside of Midland, Odessa when that shooting happened, and I'm here to tell you we have allowed that to happen. So we need to start electing people who are not beholden to the gun lobby, but actually who answer to the safety and future of our children.
Those of you that have been over the Capitol pretty much know what my position has been and will continue to be on these issues. When Ann Richards was governor of the state of Texas, I think I was the first senator to file a bill to ban assault weapons in the state of Texas. File a bill for universal background checks and also reducing the size of magazines. I've seen a lot of people come along in terms of trying to get this common sense gun law without doing damage to the Second Amendment, much like we've done with the First Amendment. And I've also seen instances where it's just not the issue of the guns, but it's the issue of mental health that we have to deal with across this country, as well as using the power of the purse of the federal government to try to get states to enact different laws like red flag laws. I think all three of those areas that we need to make certain we address those issues. Yes, it has had problems. Yes, it has had the impact on communities where kids now not only have to do fire drills, they have to do gun drills, mass shooting drills. Our children have to do that in our country. None of us ever thought that would happen, but that's exactly the case. Where you go to a mall or your kids go to school and you don't know what the condition is going to be because Texas is ground zero for mass gun shootings in this country. And so I really believe that when you begin to see some of the private sector now moving to stop the manufacturing of assault weapons, that's a good thing. And that's because of the pressure that people are putting on the outside. I agree that 80-90% of the public want to see background checks, and the private sector is beginning to respond. I think that in terms of the issue that are raised concerning red flag laws, if we want red flag laws in this country, which is a good thing, then we need to tie funding by the Department of Justice for criminal justice programs to states enacting red flag laws. And we don't have to tie all of the funding to it, but a certain portion of it, if indeed from a federal level we think that's a good policy, and I think most people think it is a good policy. In terms of mental health, we know that there's a lot of mental health issues that are floating around this country, around this state, where we see police officers go into different settings and or hear on the news where just here recently 2 people were killed down at Texas A&M at Commerce. And a lot of that's as a result of mental illness. So we did in Texas, and I think that from a federal standpoint, we should be able to help incentivize us to establish these different mental health a consortium comprised of many of the university system centers to deal with mental health related issues. We need to continue to do that around the state, and it should be encouraged by the federal government. Our children shouldn't have to grow up in an environment where they have to fear the Second Amendment and the use of guns by its citizens.
Presumably you'd need to appeal to swing voters in a statewide election. How do you appeal to them in Texas, and on what issues, and how specifically are you the best candidate to do that?
You know, one of the things I did before I made the decision to run, I tried to gauge the amount of support that I had around the state. And when I look at here in Travis County, I've got Kirk Watson, I've got Celia Israel, I've got Cheryl Cole, I've got several persons in this area, as well as around the entire state of Texas. I think that when you look at me as a state senator, which has best prepared me for this role as a United States senator, you see that I've been able to reach across the aisle in order to get support, in order to get things done. And those persons that I've worked with, some of them are going to be supportive of me as Republicans for the United States Senate. Independents will be supportive of me also. As I go around the state of Texas, and I've been to South Texas, I've been to Amarillo, I've been to Deep East Texas, I've been to the Gulf Coast. And I've not only sat down and visited with Democrats, but I've also visited with Republicans and also independents. And so I'll be able to get that support from them. I think it's going to be very important, depending upon who's our presidential, the Democrats' presidential nominee, that will impact what's going to happen in the state of Texas. And that once I become the nominee for the United States Senate, I'm going to be the person that will be able to energize the base here in the state of Texas. Without a person that can energize the base, and without a presidential candidate that can energize the base, we will not be able to win this U.S. Senate race. And so I'm best prepared to do that, given the support that I have amongst Kirk Watson, Celia Israel, Jose Rodriguez, Chewy Hinojosa in the Valley. You go to Dallas, Nathan Jones, Beverly Powell. All of those senators are very supportive, and others. And so are House members. And so being able to bring those persons together and utilize their particular networks, I don't necessarily need a lot of money to do that. I need to make certain that they're actively involved and that they're utilizing their networks in order to get the word out that they're supportive of my candidacy for the United States Senate for the primary, and that they'll do the same thing in the general election.
You know, growing up here in Texas, I believe, in my lifetime, I haven't seen voters as engaged as they are right now. It's really exciting for me to have an opportunity to be a part of that. We've been one of the lowest voter turnout states in the country for decades. And we saw last cycle, the question is how do you get swing voters? I actually think of it a little differently because I agree that energizing the base is critical. We are the only campaign that's been able to really get that grassroots enthusiasm and momentum, and the tens of thousands of miles I've driven around the state. We've got over 30,000 unique donors. Our average donation online is $22. And we've raised millions of dollars. We're also the only campaign that has raised millions of dollars. And frankly, you have to raise the resources to hire the staff to put them in place to amplify your message across the state. John Cornyn is sitting at a $12 million war chest, and we have to be able to meet that and compete with that. So it is critical that we raise the money, but also that we continue driving all over the state and hyper-localize this race. We cannot be spitting headlines at people and talking to them in sound bites and talking points. We have to be, when I'm out there talking to folks, I'm not hearing the things that are kind of like the questions that we get in these types of formats. What I'm hearing are, how do we keep good teachers in rural areas My kiddo is going to graduate from high school in this rural area, and then he or she is going to have to go move to the city to find a job and have kids, and I'm not going to get to see my grandkids. Like, how do we energize the economy in Texas to the point where, yes, we have a low unemployment number, but we have an underemployment epidemic. We have people working 2 and 3 jobs just to try to keep a roof over their head and make ends meet. And that's what I'm talking to folks about. Hyper-localizing the issues about what's important to you here, which is very different in Lubbock than it is in McAllen, from El Paso to Austin to Dallas. I mean, really, we're like 5 or 6 states put together here in Texas. And I've really enjoyed driving around the entire state and talking with people and recognizing the grassroots enthusiasm and momentum that there is to be able to send one of us to DC to deliver a healthy dose of Texas values to that broken, corrupt system right now. Right now, when we look at DC, we don't see us reflected back, working families. That I come from blue-collar, rural roots here in Texas, and I don't see people who have worried about whether or not Social Security will be there for them. I don't see, when I look at DC, people who have worried about where they're going to find access to health care or worried about the safety of the kids that they're sending off to schools. When you have a group of people that have not faced the challenges that they have been charged with finding solutions to, no wonder they can't prioritize it and fix something like Social Security, which is something we never talk about, but that's what I hear about on the road. So that's how we're going to win. We're going to appeal to independent voters. Last cycle, I beat the spread big time in my congressional district. The guy I ran against won his last midterm by 32 points, and he beat me by 2.9 because I grabbed all of the independent votes available in that district, just not by coming to the middle and not by appealing to swing voters, but actually talking to people, hyper-localizing it, and grabbing those independent votes while keeping the base engaged.
You said, Senator, that the Democratic nominee for president will impact this race or impact the Texas vote. Is there a candidate who would energize that vote that you see right now? Care to share that?
No.
Okay.
No, there's not.
2 minutes and
candidate.
55
no,
seconds left.
No, I will not share that. Right.
Gotcha.
Someone's sharing.
I know.
I suppose you don't want to.
I honestly don't know who I'm going to vote for yet. I can tell you that regardless of who's at the top of the ticket, I'm going to beat John Cornyn. And a lot of that is because we don't have straight party ticket voting. We have independent thought here in Texas. I mean, we're the Lone Star State. We do our own Pledge of Allegiance. We fly our flag equal to the American flag. We're Texas. You don't see, Iowa edition pickup trucks on the road. We have an identity here in Texas that is unique. And I believe that the people here in Texas want effective disruptors that don't accept the system and say, hey, I'm going to operate within this system to move the needle on our values. They say, no, this system is broken, and I am going to disrupt this system and put better guidelines in place so that we can actually work for working families instead of high-dollar donors.
Well, and then when you begin to look at the presidential candidates, we've got to make certain we have some presidential candidate that's going to be pro-public schools, so that when they begin to make appointments, that they'll take into consideration making a pro-public school secretary of education that's not trying to privatize the system. And so those messages will begin to become clearer and clearer as those individuals come closer and closer to Texas. And Texans will make a decision. We don't need Washington to make decisions for Texas. We need Texans to make decisions here in Texas.
I wanted to give my colleagues a chance to ask questions.
On Pathway to Citizenship, do you envision a one-time offer available only to people already here in violation of our laws, or will it be an offer that goes forward to the future to future people here in violation of our laws?
Either one of us or both of us?
I was looking at you.
All right.
I can
All right, that's fine. In terms of, state your question again so I can make sure I
Would it
understood
be,
the
so if we
comment.
establish a pathway to citizenship, we say, here's the steps you have to go through to become a citizen. Is it just for people already here in violation of our laws, or would it also apply to people in the future who come here?
No, I think it should apply to people that are here already in violation of our laws, and that we need to make certain we have a date certain, that we look at making certain that those persons are able to have a pathway to citizenship, and everyone else coming in after that need to come through a process that we've codified that would allow them to have a pathway to citizenship if they if they're eligible to get a pathway to citizenship, or whatever type of status that they need in this country. Everybody that's coming to this country doesn't necessarily want to be a citizen. Some of them are coming because they just want to work. And so it's obviously very important for us to make certain that we do what's important in those countries that they're coming from, to the extent America can, to engage those governments to provide employment opportunities there, as opposed to those persons coming over to Texas. Let's be real clear. The Texas economy would pretty much shut down if everyone here that's here illegally would end up having to go back. And so we've got to have a pathway to citizenship to those persons that have been here, the children and the DACA program, and others that have paid taxes, done the things that we want, and served in our services. We've got to make certain that we provide a pathway to citizenship for those particular persons that are here now, have a date certain that it would cut off, and then the other persons that are involved in the process would end up, other persons coming in, that we would end up having a pathway to citizenship for them that they would have to follow, or whatever type of status they're coming here for.
I think that it's frankly an oversimplification the way the question is worded, in violation of our laws, because as the laws change and as people's statuses get revoked without sometimes them even knowing it, we have military enlistments that get, people get de-enlisted, which a bipartisan board found 90% of citizenship pursuing de-enlistments were invalid. We have people whose green cards expired, dreamers who were pursuing programs that expire. We have expanded travel bans. I mean, the laws in this country keep changing with every administration, and really every morning mood of this administration, it seems like. So I don't think we should be thinking of it in those terms. I think we should be thinking of it in what immigration system do we want to reflect the values of our country? Are we the American dream? Are we where people come to make a better life for their children? Because if we are that grants us a lot of privileges globally. If we're not that, we should own up to that and say we're no longer that. I hope that that's not true. I hope we're not seeing the light of freedom and hope and democracy and the beacon that brings people to our country to make a better life for themselves and their family going out. I believe that we need a pathway to citizenship that recognizes that we're talking about human beings that are trying to find a better life for their children and who are contributing to our economy, and not just working, but actually buying products. And they are our neighbors, they are our friends, they're my kids' teachers at schools. And I think it otherizes people to say you're an illegal and I'm a citizen because of the dirt that was under my feet when I was born. We need to start looking at people as human beings and say what's best for our country, what's best for our state, and what policies speak to our soul as a nation and a state.
Ask about impeachment. If you were in the Senate tomorrow, you'd be casting a historic vote. Would you vote to convict and remove this president? And what do you tell Texans who see this president as someone who gets them, who is speaking for the rural, disaffected person who looks to Trump as
She's first.
as their savior?
I feel like there are people who are looking for someone who's not a politician for the reasons that I've laid out. The fact that the system is broken, it's corrupt, it's serving donors, it's serving backdoor deals with cigars and good old boys clubs, and that makes this president attractive to them somewhat, that he speaks his mind and they always know where he stands and that he's disrupting the apple cart. And I think that that's why they'll vote for me. There were people in my congressional district who voted for Ted Cruz and voted for me for that same reason. I would argue Ted Cruz is not that, but he has a perception and a brand that he's that. So a third of our state is not making decisions based on policy. They're looking for fighters, somebody who can effectively disrupt a broken system. But as far as impeachment goes, obviously I would have voted to have an actual fair trial, to see documents and hear witnesses. I think that most Americans, regardless of party line, would like to have seen that. I would not be going and asking party leadership what my opinion is before I vote, which is what John Cornyn does. And I completely understand, as a person who served in our military and who national security is very important to me, and, I completely understand the people who want to remove this president because of abusing his power and withholding vital security assistance to one of our allies that really only helped Russia, by the way, who is constantly undermining our democracy and trying to attack our elections. I see career diplomats. I see a State Department full of career diplomats, by the way, who have served both Republicans and Democrats, getting villainized and leaving and retiring and getting fired, and that's scary to me as a person in uniform, because diplomacy is our first line of defense, and the State Department is really the military's first line of defense. I feel like this administration uses our military as a first resort instead of a last resort. So what's happening with diplomacy around the world is concerning to me. But I also served on a 19-country coalition in Afghanistan, and my friends that I served with are asking me what's happening over here in America and what we're doing. And so I also see the value of removing this president at the ballot box and showing the country this is not who we are. So the thing that's most disturbing to me is the lack of respect for the co-equal branches of government, ignoring subpoenas, acting like they don't need to inform Congress before committing acts of war, and things like that.
So if you were in the Senate tomorrow...
Frankly, I think it's disingenuous for anyone to say how they would vote who isn't in the room hearing the testimony. I think that it's pandering to one side or the other. I can tell you that I am very concerned of the actions that I've seen in the public and portrayed on the news, because I'm not in the room during the testimony. And then I think that if you undermine our national security for your own personal political gain, then you should be impeached. But I don't think it's right. I think it undermines the process to talk about how you would vote if you don't see all the evidence.
Let me answer your question specifically, okay? I'm an attorney. I've been an attorney for 40 years. I understand rules of evidence and procedure. And I understand this is a political body. The evidence that I've seen thus far, to me, warrant impeachment. Given the fact that Republicans, for some strange reason, don't want to hear additional evidence as it relates to what Bolton would say, a person in the room at the time that said, at least media reports show, that the president was fully aware of what occurred. Given what the president has said himself, given what Mulvaney has said himself, I would vote for impeachment. That's answering your question specifically.
What would you say to Trump supporters around the state?
Well, the fact is...
You get rid of our guys. So.
Well, here's the deal. I know that you have to make hard decisions. My decision would not be based on politics, but would be based on the facts. And that's the way that I would respond to those persons that are Trump supporters, frankly. And if some strange reason they don't want to be supportive of me based on my vote, then I understand that. But I will make a decision based on the facts, because I've had to make hard decisions, regardless of party affiliation. And I've made those decisions. I'll continue to do that as a U.S. Senator.
So you're saying you would vote for removal, not just impeachment?
I'm sorry?
You said you would vote for removal and not just impeachment?
I was asked whether I'd vote for impeachment, okay? And now you're saying removal.
Yeah.
I understand that that's where the fuzzy comes in, so to speak. I understand that Joe Manchin is looking at some censure. I don't want to hear that debate and be in the room when that debate is taking place to decide whether or not I would do censure or removal.
And when you were talking about Cruz also having a reputation as a disruptor, when
Yeah.
Beto ran against him, he played Cornyn as the good senator compared to Cruz, because he was somebody you could cooperate with, more reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that Senator West, you obviously dealt with Cornyn over a lifetime of public service. Is that a reputation that he deserves now, or deserved at some point, or have things changed?
Are you asking me?
I guess I'm asking both of you, but to start with you, I guess.
Okay. I'm disappointed in John Cornyn. I worked with John Cornyn as the Attorney General of the state of Texas, when he asked me to help him with legislation concerning child support. But when I first announced for public office, he wanted to label me a radical and as a liberal. That's probably his machine that was doing that. I'm disappointed in John Cornyn as it relates to standing up for the Constitution of this country, as an officer of the court, as an attorney, as a former Attorney General of the state of Texas, and saying he did not need to hear evidence from Mulvaney or Bolton. That wasn't a John Cornyn that I worked with when he's Attorney General. Something happened to him in Washington. It's real clear that what's happened to him, that he's been kind of co-opted with the Republican Party in terms of doing the things that he is currently doing. And frankly, he's been called by this president to do things that he would not, John Cornyn I knew years ago would not do. And I'm frankly disappointed in that. And that's one of the reasons that I'm running too.
It's a very different race from Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz and John Cornyn are very different, even though 40% of our state self-identifies as Republican, 30% Democrat. Those 70% people see them as the same. They're voting the same, they're proposing the same legislation, they're supporting the same legislation largely, okay? So those people are going to make their decision on who they're going to vote for, based on whether or not they agree with that legislation, right? But why in that state with 40% self-identifies as Republican would Ted Cruz have a 52% approval rating and Cornyn have a 35 to, I think the latest poll was like 38? I mean, that means Cornyn loses Republican votes. I guess he got bumped up 3 more points after, saying he didn't want to see documents and witnesses maybe from the base. So you have Ted Cruz who gets a large chunk of independent votes and John Cornyn who doesn't. And you have to understand why, because if they're voting the same and they're proposing the same legislation, what is it about Ted Cruz that's different to independent voters than John Cornyn? It's in that leadership style decision making. You have to remember that Ted Cruz beat Donald Trump in the Republican primary in 2016 by 17 points. That's a landslide in a crowded field. With the higher approval rating, I would knock on doors in my congressional district that had yard signs that said Ted Cruz, MJ Hegar. That threw me for a loop. I didn't understand that at first until I would knock on the door. And I would say, I want to make sure you know I'm a Democrat. I know as a combat vet, sometimes people think that means they have to be a Republican, but more and more, there's more combat vets standing up for our Constitution who are running as Democrats. And I would knock on the door and say, I'm a Democrat, right? You know that I defend marginalized communities. I'm pro-choice. I'm pro-LGBT rights. I believe in healthcare as a human right, and they say, yeah. Don't talk to us about your partisan stuff. We want a fighter. We want a disruptor. And I'm like, Ted Cruz, a fighter? But he cut his teeth politically on disrupting the Republican establishment. I mean, they see him as an effective disruptor like they see me. That's why I get that independent vote. That independent vote doesn't go to a moderate, whoever's in the middle the most. It goes to the person who has the characteristics and the leadership traits that they're looking for, because frankly, most people in this state don't want to have to pay attention to every vote that we take. They want to send us there and believe we are fighting for working families so they can take their eye off that ball and focus on keeping a roof over their head and food on their table. So I outperformed all the statewide candidates in the rural half of my district. In an R+10 district, I should have lost by a lot more. And we lost by 2.9. We way beat the spread. We would have won in Vegas if we were laying odds. And we're going to beat the odds again this cycle. If my district was as red as the state, we would have won. And so we're going to win now.
Tattoo?
Have I pulled the tattoo?
Yeah,
I can't take it off,
I didn't know
so.
whether that's a good thing for those who want to disrupt her.
Frankly, I don't care what polling doesn't tell me how to behave or how to speak. It does say, I will look at polling if I want to talk about healthcare, immigration, clean government, climate change, and gun rights, and it tells me everybody wants to talk about climate change and clean government and healthcare, then I'll talk more about those 3 things. But it doesn't change what I say or who I am. This tattoo covers shrapnel scars that I got in Afghanistan. I was tired of seeing those scars when I would reach for my kiddos, and it's in my nature to take something painful and ugly and turn it into something beautiful, which is what I'm going to try to do with our seat that's currently being held by John Cornyn.
In terms of the independent voting, because I've talked to independents across the state, what they want is someone that can get things done and will negotiate, will work with the other side to come up with a common solution to problems in this country. Let me give you an example. When I had to deal with issues concerning the trust between minority communities and the police, I was able to bring in the NRA, I was able to bring in the NAACP, ACLU, police groups in order to come up with a common agenda in terms of what the behavioral expectations are of citizens and police officers and the rights of citizens during traffic stops. And I was able to put it on a video that many people have to see now in terms of, and it didn't have anything to do with me running for the United States, and it wasn't anything
as a punishment, by the way.
well, good. But I mean, the fact is, being able to get things done, working across the aisle. I have a history of doing that. without sacrificing principle, making certain that I stay at the table, recognizing that I may not get 100% of everything that I want at the time, but if I can get 15 to 20% and then come back and fight for the rest, that's what you do. And that's what the independent voters want to see me do here in the state of Texas and also in the United States Capitol.
It's a bit of an esoteric question, but I think it gets to the heart of public service. Do you believe an elected official's role is to do what he or she thinks is right, or what he or she thinks his or her constituents want?
I think that the role is to do what they think is right. And it's the voter's role to determine if what I think is right is best for this state. And there may be times when we don't agree, but as long as people have access to me, not just if they donate, but actual constituent services and access to me and a seat at my table, then we can talk through solutions. There's a lot of times there's unintended consequences of well-intended policy. For example, when I'm out talking about renewable energy is the future, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers took me aside and said, can you make sure if you're talking about renewable energy that you're also talking about modernizing our grid? Because if we don't modernize our grid, renewable energy won't be able to handle peak load. That's a great example of, you have a seat at my table, you can point out an unintended consequence of a policy. That's how we come together. And I have to say, this is something we very much disagree about. You don't fight for 15 or 20% of what you want. When I went to DC, I went to open 238,000 jobs for women. There were people in my camp that said, let's open the Army jobs and then see how that goes. We open all the jobs because that's the value. And if we give on that, then we show we don't fully believe that we should open these jobs for women. We went there and we built a broad coalition not by compromising and sacrificing. We went there by sacrificing our egos and humbling ourselves and not insisting on pushing our reasons for things on people. We would talk to people on the left and say, it's unconstitutional to bar women from applying for these jobs. It's a women's rights issue. And also, people on the right, it's a military effectiveness issue. The Joint Chiefs unanimously recommend we open these jobs. It's hurting recruiting. It's hurting retention. It's tying the hands of the commanders in the field. That's how you do it. You do it by finding the what's in it for me and the motivation in the person you're talking to instead of pushing your reasons on people. And we demanded all jobs be open, and we effectively built a broad coalition without being donors, without having political capital, without backroom deals and cigar-filled rooms, and we opened every single job for women in the military.
My opponent obviously misunderstood the point I was trying to make. I recognize you don't settle for 15 to 20%. Let me give you an example. When we were doing hate crimes in this state, we made certain that we got a hate crimes law. My Republican colleagues didn't want to include, frankly, the LGBTQ community, but we were insistent that we included them. And so we fought for 100%, and we got 100%. But I also recognize that as a person that's been in the negotiation room with other politicians, that they have their interests also. And so the question is do you want to get something done that furthers your objective? You do as much as you can to get the 100%. If you can't get the 100%, you get as much as you can and come back and fight for other things later on. That's what I was talking about.
This is the biggest difference between us.
Well,
and frankly, we're going to make a great team later.
The reality is
we're going to work together on a lot, but this is the one thing.
If that's the difference, then that is the difference. But I've been there. I've had the experience in those rooms, and I had to make a decision as to whether or not to just say the hell with all of it, or try to get as much as I can during that point in time, and then move forward.
I disagree.
Well, you can disagree with that. That's fine.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
It sounds like my dinner table.
We actually are great friends. I think we're going to work very well together afterwards.
Well, we're getting to know one another.
We're going to fight for a lot of the same things after the primary.
It's always tough in primary, and frankly, in these endorsement interviews in primaries, because generally, people running for a nomination for a party, they're in that party because they agree on most things.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So the choice of the voters becomes to some extent experience, personality, how much of the pie you're going to fight for, 100% or 90%, and it's difficult because people in a party generally agree. I mean, do you know of any major issues you two disagree on?
I think we view some things differently, but no, I think we're going to fight for a lot of the same things.
I mean, basically, based on the forums that we've been at together, I think that we agree pretty much on the same fundamental deals.
Sure.
It may very well be the issue of how do we get there.
I think I'd be interested in hearing from both of you. I know we're near the end of the time, but why you want to run for this seat specifically. I mean, Senator, you've talked about being able to carve out a space for yourself and do things in the State House, which I think is no small feat for a Democrat. I imagine that's hard to walk away from. And MJ, you talked about coming so close in 2018. Why not run for that seat again? Why for the Senate? Why is this the way you can be most effective?
Which one do you want to go
Both,
first?
Whoever wants to go.
Okay. If my goal was to get a fancy pen and a brass nameplate, I'd run for Congress again. My goal is not to get into a seat and to actually get elected to something. My goal as a wildfire suppression helicopter pilot was to get the biggest bucket of water I could find and dump it on the biggest fire I could find. Last cycle, the fire was in the House. I feel like we accomplished great things in that cycle. We showed that district that these races are close, so your vote matters. We flipped 2 state House seats by running a strongly coordinated campaign. We made national Republicans spend money in that district to protect that seat. So we helped flip the U.S. House, too. And we forced that sitting incumbent who thought he was safe to see that he's not so safe. So he voted for the Violence Against Women Act. He's holding town halls. We changed things in that district. Super proud of what we did there. We were not able to ultimately overcome the hugely partisan gerrymandering that we have in that district. The reason I'm not running for that seat is because I believe the fire is in the Senate now. I believe an ass-kicking combat veteran working mom can beat John Cornyn, that's what it takes. That it's going to take an effective outsider, an effective disruptor in order to break him, because his biggest vulnerability is that he's a career politician who can't get anything done. So I provide the most contrast to that. I'm running for this because we've got to get our government functioning again for Texas working families. Does anybody realize that there's an election security bill still not getting a vote because of Mitch McConnell and his legislative graveyard? I'm concerned that we're not going to get anything done in this country, and that there are serious things that people are dying in this country because of the inaction on legislation, whether it's gun safety or healthcare, climate change. We absolutely have to get our government working again. So I'm running for this seat because I can beat John Cornyn, and because I'm not going to sit through any more Supreme Court nominations of hyper-partisan, ultra-conservative judges. I'm not going to allow it down in the federal courts either. And in order to do that, in order for us to flip the U.S. Senate and get our government working again, we have to unseat John Cornyn.
You know, the Texas that John Cornyn is continuing to represent is not the Texas of today. The demographics of this state has changed. And for some strange reason, he hasn't grasped that in terms of policy considerations. The Violence Against Women's Act, he has not been supportive of. The issue concerning the Voting Rights Act, where has he been on that? Where has he been on gun issues? Those are things now that Texans want addressed. And I'm the person that has the track record of addressing those in the state Senate, in the state legislature. I'm the person that stood up for it. Many of you have been over there and you know what my record is. When we had to deal with tough issues, I was there. And I'll be there in the U.S. Senate to do the same thing. There's a lot of issues concerning the changing demographics and in terms of the uninsured here in the state of Texas that for some reason Cornyn is tone deaf to. And it's becoming a greater portion of our population, but he hasn't addressed it. So you have to have a senator that understands those issues, because he's talked to people throughout this entire state about those issues, and understand that there are choices that are having to be made. It's something else to have an elderly person come to your office to seek support, monetary support, because they have to make a choice between paying their rent, not mortgage, paying their rent and buying prescription drugs. That's happened over and over again in my capacity as a state senator. So that's why I say he's tone deaf. He's not representing Texas values. My colleagues, some 10 of them in the Senate and some 48 in the House, have agreed that I'm the right person to represent Democrats and this state in the United States Senate, and that's why I'm running.
Would you be running if your state Senate seat was up this cycle?
Yes, I would. I'm committed to this. Understand something, and the reality is this. If I wasn't committed to doing this, I wouldn't be doing it. I don't have to do it, but I need to do it for the state of Texas, and that's why I'm in it.
How are we doing on time?
I think we're there.
Oh, come on. A few more questions. Come on. We're just getting warmed up.
So you say you don't think Trump's a good president?
You think? Do you think he's a good president? That's
I
what
think
you're
he's
telling
the
me.
president.
You think he's a president?
Can I mention something that often gets overlooked that I neglected also to say? The gun violence epidemic extends beyond mass shootings into suicide and domestic violence and kids accidentally finding weapons. I really think that we need to be thinking about these issues broader, both in my answers and in the questions that we ask candidates, and talk about, instead of thinking of them in silos, but how they connect with each other. You know, so I just think we have a lot of work to do. I'm excited to work with Senator West as we move forward.
And that's
in the
State
decades to
Senator
come.
West you want to work with, right?
I think he has a big, bright future. Maybe he'll replace Ted Cruz, and we'll be senators next to each other.
Well, let me give you a penny for your thoughts.